200 and about 2020 years ago, I should say, in the Roman province of Judea, as you just heard, there were a group of shepherds who had gotten stuck on the night shift. Now, generally speaking, the night shift was not very exciting. There wasn't a lot to do after the sun went down back in those days. Most of the people that they would have talked to were asleep or were heading to bed. There wasn't a lot to do. Even the animals themselves were snoozing. And so it was mostly a matter of just trying to stay awake in case something unexpected happened. But then one day, approximately 2020 years ago, something unexpected did happen. All of a sudden, as the shepherds were sitting there, the sky lit up around them, and an angel of the Lord appeared before them and delivered this history-altering message. I'm bringing you good news of great joy for all the people. To you is born this day in the city of David a Savior who is the Messiah. Now, we can tell from the powerful way in which this message was delivered that it was an important message, right? If an angel appeared before me and lights shone around me, it frankly wouldn't matter what that angel had to say. I would take it quite seriously. But even if we didn't have this kind of powerful theatrical presentation, the message itself would have been revolutionary in the Bible story. Because for hundreds upon hundreds of years, we have heard people speaking about the Messiah, anticipating the Messiah, looking forward to the Messiah, and finally, someone comes along and says, to you is born this day the Savior, the Messiah. So to fully appreciate this, let's wind the clock back even a little bit further, going before the province of Judea was under the control of the Romans, or the Greeks, or the Persians, or the Babylonians, for that matter. Back into the late days when the kings of Israel and Judah still ruled in the land of Canaan. But some of the most insightful prophets knew that that time was coming to an end. One of those figures, a prophet named Micah, recognized that both the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah would soon fall, and offered a sobering speech in which he noted that Jerusalem would be surrounded by a siege one day, and that siege would overpower them and take down their ruler, striking him with a rod on his cheek. And although this was an important message that had to be delivered, not everything that Micah said was all doom and gloom. He at the very same time offered this word of hope to the people who went through that experience. But you, O Bethlehem of Ephrathah, who are one of the little clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to rule in Israel, whose origin is from old, from ancient days. And he shall stand and feed his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, and they shall live secure, for now he shall be great to the ends of the earth. This was a prophecy of a Messiah, of a figure who would come along after Israel had gone through its most difficult experience, after Jerusalem had been taken down and the people had been spread out into captivity, who would restore them and give them hope and security and dignity once again. But it took a long time for this prophecy to be fulfilled. Years, decades, centuries passed, while the people kept waiting and looking for this Messiah. They didn't forget it. A number of others, in fact, remembered and expanded upon the promises that Micah had made. For example, the prophet Isaiah said that he's named Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, these titles of authority that were bestowed upon him. And then many years later, the prophet Jeremiah came along and added that he shall execute righteousness and justice in the land. He will be the one who will lead us to this harmonious and just society. And later still, the prophet Zechariah came along and promised that the battle bow shall be cut off and he shall command peace to the nations, noting that the Messiah would bring not just Israel restoration, but a global era of peace. And then Daniel tops it all off still by giving this Messiah supernatural qualities and describing him as one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. Now, these are beautiful and attractive, sweet descriptions that the people of God carried along with them like honey. But there can be a problem if you hold on to a jar of honey for too long and you don't use it. And that's that the honey can harden, it can crystallize. So when the time comes to actually pour it into action, it gets stuck. It doesn't actually go anywhere. Even if you have never let go of hope, if you hold on to a hope for too long and don't see anything happen with it, there's a tendency for it to transform into something else. I once heard a story about a young driver, a teenager, I should say, who was wanting to learn how to drive. But besides just wanting to go to driver's ed and learn how to run a normal vehicle like her friends, she had in mind that she wanted to drive a stick shift. She knew that her father had this old car that sat along the side of the garage that was a special manual vehicle. And he was the only person that she knew who could drive a stick shift. And so she came up one day and asked him, "Will you teach me how to drive a stick?" And he was pleased. He didn't think that his kids would ever have any interest in this. And so he said, "Yes, sure, I'd be happy to teach you, but not today. I've got some other things going on today. We'll have to do it another time." She was okay with this. She wasn't expecting him to drop what he was doing that very day to teach her. So she waits until the next weekend, and then she asks him again, "Can you teach me how to drive a stick shift?" And he says again, "Yes, but not today. The weather is not really great for it. It's kind of slick outside, but we will do it someday." Well, unfortunately, this pattern continued. The next weekend, it wasn't time because he was having some work done on the car and he didn't want to do anything to mess it up. And the next weekend, there was something going on in town and there was too much traffic. And then before long, the weather turned and it was too cold to be experimenting with something new. And yet, the young lady never gave up, week after week, continuing to just ask the same question: "Could you teach me how to drive a stick shift today?" And getting the same answer. It had become, in fact, a kind of ritual in between the two of them, to the point that it was like a running joke. She would ask if today was the day, and he would say, "Not today, but someday I will." Until one day, on a Saturday morning, she asked him, "Today the day you're going to teach me to drive a stick?" And he says, "Yes." At that point, she realized that she had lost her nerve over the course of the months of asking. He'd, after all, told her about all the things that could go wrong if the weather was too slick, if there was too much traffic, something had happened to damage this precious vehicle. And so all of a sudden, when the moment of opportunity came, she said, "Actually, I'm not sure if I am ready today." And I think that kind of thing can happen with just about any type of hope when it's been lasting for a long time. It might be that there is a religious seeker who has wanted to ask questions and inquire about whether or not it was time to take on the faith, but they find that the questions were always more complicated than they thought, that the answers themselves needed to be scrutinized, and after months and months of going on, they might find themselves in a position where they didn't know if they would ever hear enough clarity to make a faith decision. And they'd gotten stuck in this kind of place of perpetual seeking, of ongoing agnosticism, instead of being willing to go and make a choice. Likewise, it can happen to a person who feels a calling from God to embrace some kind of a radical mission. Perhaps God is asking me as an individual or us as a church to take on some great task, but something comes along and delays it. And then the delay goes longer than expected, and it's followed by yet another. And it feels more and more like a distant dream that we will never be ready to bring into action. Or perhaps there are those among us who have been praying for change, something in our own lives, something in one of our relationships that isn't right. We ask God to do something about it. You pray and it doesn't change. And over time, you find that you're kind of comfortable the way things are. Your prayers haven't stopped, but they've kind of hardened. You don't really expect it to translate into action. What are we supposed to do when we find ourselves in this kind of a situation? I think it's possible that even the shepherds might have felt this way when they first heard the message. What were they supposed to do with this news that the Messiah had come? Was it true? What did it mean? What kind of response did it call on them? But I appreciate the way that this father responded when his daughter told him that she wasn't sure if she was ready to drive the stick. He said, "Look, I know I've been talking to you for months about all the things that could go wrong, about all of the issues with the weather and the traffic and the ways that a car could be damaged. But don't worry about that, because I am with you. And today is the day to go." The shepherds, perhaps because they were shepherds, didn't allow themselves to be stuck like so many of the religious figures of Jesus' day. I'm not saying that there's no value in asking discerning questions or in making a plan, but they were able to hear that message that today, right now, this day is the moment when salvation has come. And so even if you don't know exactly what you're supposed to do with it, you can accept it and embrace it and allow it to move you and proclaim good news. We may never get to a point where we know if all of the circumstances work out for us to be able to make the changes we want to make or to do the things we want to do. But we don't need all of those things to work out. All we need is to hear the words that God is with us. And for Christians, this isn't just an example of a moment of action that had occurred 2020 years ago. It marks the beginning of a new era, an era that we still inhabit, a today in which God is always present and available if we can only hear God's voice. That's why the writers of the New Testament proclaim things like Paul did in 2 Corinthians, saying, "See, this is the acceptable time. This is the day of salvation." When the moment of salvation and hope arrives, then the right response is to embrace it and to let it move us. Friends, I don't know about you, but this pandemic has often left me feeling stuck and trapped and waiting for some kind of circumstances to change. But the good news is that salvation is here, that God has spoken. And if we can hear that message in our own ears, that new life has been born for us, then we can begin to proclaim the good news today because God is with us.